All right, so let's talk about Acts 15 for a moment. The issue is in verse 1. Some men came down from Judea. They came down. They descended the mountain. It wasn't north-south. They went to a lower place. And were teaching the brethren. And this is what they were teaching them. Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Verse 2, and Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them. In other words, there was a big fight about that because Paul and Barnabas, who had already been on their first journey proclaiming the gospel, say, yeah, you can, because we've seen it happen. You can include people into this family of God through Jesus without them being circumcised as a religious act. And that sets off this conversation. So there's this, what we call it is a council. It's never really called a council in the scripture, but essentially it has all the earmarks of a council. You have church leaders that come together and they're going to debate this. Now, the Reimer article has kind of a nice organizational structure there called a chiastic structure, A, B, C, and then he calls it the fulcrum, and then C prime, B prime, A prime, that kind of arrangement. That's called a chiasm. It's a literary structure. It's helpful for memorization. And we'll talk about whether Reimer proves this point there. But one of the things that's important here that doesn't come out in the Reimer article that I think is important is they introduce testimony. Two leaders that are fundamentally important to listen to in the book of Acts are St. Peter and St. Paul. You have Simon Peter, who speaks and talks about his experience and recounts, and I thought Reimer actually did an excellent job with the emphasis that it brings to the experience with Cornelius. But you have Simon Peter, who recounts what happened at Cornelius' house and how the Spirit fell on them. That is really important because of who Simon Peter is. If you look at the book of Acts, one of the things that you'll see is that the church is in some ways dominated by Simon Peter in the first half of the book and then by St. Paul in the second half of the book. So St. Peter, St. Paul, these two figures, these are other than Jesus, they are the mammoth New Testament figures. You could also make an argument for St. John, but St. John is certainly a prolific writer, but in terms of the impact of the preaching, Saints Peter and Paul seem to hold the dominant position there. So then, because St. Paul had not really yet risen to the ascendancy, it's important that Simon Peter's voice be related there. And then St. Paul, with Barnabas, they tell about what they have experienced. And it's interesting going forward, Peter fades from the scene. Now Luke is telling us, mainly the story of what Paul does because it fits his theological paradigm, right? It's about theology, it's about geography. And then this council, though, kind of placed right here in the center of the book of Acts, also is a kind of fulcrum, right? It says this is the issue. And in fact, again, as I mentioned, when you look at St. Paul's letters, to some extent, if you look at St. Peter's letters, maybe even James, we find that this kind of conflict, this church struggle, is the struggle in the first century. And the church has struggles throughout its history with different issues, but this is the theological struggle that they have. Can you become a Christian without converting to Judaism? That is their theological question. We'll come back in just a few minutes and talk just a little bit about Fowler.